Hello, everyone. Austin Ersley here with the Limestone Library, and I'm very excited for our Digging Deeper into Fake News program with Jim Kirk. I had some. I anticipated that would have some difficulty with the live presentation ever since moving to e-programs with COVID. So I'm excited to offer this to you through YouTube and Facebook later on if you are deciding to join us much later. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Jim.
Thank you, Austin, and welcome everyone. And I'm sorry we all can't be together today for this discussion. Like you, I missed the interactions. Our staff at Crain Chicago Business has been working from home since about mid-March, and I think we're all getting a little tired of communicating through Zoom, or what we affectionately call our daily Hollywood Squares meeting. But just a little brief history about me. I'm currently publisher and executive editor of Crain Chicago Business. Prior to that, I was interim editor-in-chief and then editor-in-chief of the Los Angeles Times. I was also publisher and editor of the Chicago Sun-Times for 6 years prior to my time in LA. I was also a longtime reporter and editor at the Chicago Tribune, and also ran the politics and government team at Bloomberg News in Washington. When Austin and I first discussed doing this today, the world was in a much different place. If only we had to worry about fake news. Our first discussion on the topic was some time before the pandemic hit our shores and before the murder of George Floyd, which has sparked some of the most significant discussions around racism, policing, and injustice that I've seen in my lifetime. From a pure journalism standpoint, the last 12 weeks or so have been both frightening and thrilling. And despite our topic today, Crain's and many other traditional news publications have seen an incredible surge in interest with readers hanging in to stay informed. Our digital subscriptions alone in March and April were up more than 150% year over year as concern about the pandemic situation exploded. But the pandemic has also taken a toll on our industry. Already faced with the traditional print newspaper model under tremendous disruption, retail advertising plummeted when stay-at-home orders were put in place. While we at Crain's have been really able to withstand some of these intense headwinds, some of our competitors have not and have had to put reporters and editors on furlough, or worse, have had to lay off reporters and editors. In fact, one small Chicago suburban chain of newspapers, 22nd Century Media, had to fold entirely early on in the pandemic, leaving several communities without their own newspaper. We'll get a little more into the business model later in the discussion. I usually start these talks off with a little news quiz. We'll do an abbreviated version on it, so I'll obviously do all the answering, but hopefully this will be sort of fun. So play along if you can in your own head. I'm going to give you bits of information from 3 news stories you may or may not have come across via your Twitter or Facebook or Instagram feeds or email, someone have shared. You may have clicked on them, read some of them, or may have just shared without reading. Then after I give the descriptions of all 3, I'll let you think about them and decide whether you think the story was fake or real. Again, don't worry, I'll give you the answer. So here we go. Story number 1. A police officer in Kansas was shocked when he bought a coffee at the local McDonald's and saw the word pig and an expletive scrawled on the cup. The chief of police in Harrington said one of his officers went to the drive-thru in Junction City Saturday on his way to work when he received the insulting label. Quote, "This is what he paid for," Police Chief Brian Hornaday wrote on Facebook along with an image of the cup. "This is likely the act of one person and not a representation of the company," Hornaday said. When the incident was brought to the fast food giant's attention, they offered the cop a free lunch. All right. Story number 2. The 71-year-old physician's life at a California university is now under intense scrutiny as detectives investigate allegations that he sexually abused hundreds of patients over nearly 3 decades. The complaints began in the 1990s when coworkers, patients, and nurses accused him of, quote, creepy behavior. And then story number 3. CrowdStrike, a California-based cybersecurity firm that was hired by the Democratic National Committee in 2016 to investigate the breach of its email system, is Ukrainian-owned and moved the DNC's computer server to Ukraine. All right, so you got that. We have the first story about the officer was shocked when he bought a coffee at the local McDonald's and saw the word pig and an expletive scrawled on his cup. Story number two, the California physician who was being accused of sexually abusing hundreds of patients over a number of decades. And then three, the California-based cybersecurity firm hired by the DNC, which is accused of having moved the DNC's computer server to Ukraine. So let's see where we're at. In story number one, the one about the police officer, the answer to that story is false. It's a fake story. According to the News Literacy Project, a McDonald's employee did not write that on the side of a coffee cup. The 23-year-old officer would later say that he wrote it as a joke, even though he posted it online and went viral. At the time, the police officer's bosses believed a McDonald's employee had written it. The officer resigned late last year, but not before the New York Post had picked it up and ran with the story. Story number two, the one about the university physician who was being investigated for possibly sexually abusing hundreds of patients. That story is true, and I should know. I was editor of the Los Angeles Times when 3 reporters broke that blockbuster story that a gynecologist at the University of Southern California had been accused of abusing dozens of college students' patients for decades. And we'll get back to that story in just a minute. All right, the third and last story about CrowdStrike, the cybersecurity firm being owned by a Ukrainian company, and the DNC servers that were moved to Ukraine. That story is false. It was a narrative President Donald Trump had touted publicly and through his social media for the last few years as he sought to pin the interference of the 2016 election on Ukraine instead of Russia. It's been repeated on everything from Breitbart to Fox News, even though the assertion has been debunked many times. I often use these examples to demonstrate the state of play when it comes to fake news versus real news from traditional news sources. In the countless news feeds on Twitter and Facebook and increasingly on Instagram, both real and false information sometimes flow together, making it unclear to the casual news reader whether something that catches their eye is real or false. And as more and more readers continue to get their news through social media platforms, the blend of fake and real is intensified as more and more readers share those stories. The traditional news industry, the one that has been trusted with truth-telling for hundreds of years, is in uncharted territory, battling both real fake news and its effect on the industry, and a White House that lumps traditional news media with fake news by labeling outlets that question and press them as peddling fake news, leaving casual readers of news bewildered, unsure about what they are reading, or believing things that are true that are patently false. The influx of fake news sites and so-called content farms that pump out millions of fake stories have done more to undermine the trust readers have in news than anything we've seen in the last half of a century. Even during this historic pandemic, fake news is prevalent and expanding and putting the health and safety of millions around the world at risk. As early as April, the United Nations issued a warning saying, quote, unreliable and false information is spreading around the world to such an extent that some commentators are now referring to the new avalanche of misinformation that's accompanied the COVID-19 pandemic as a disinfodemic, end quote. And as we head into another significant political season, there is no doubt that the same forces at work 4 years ago to seed disruption and fear into our political system are at work again to warp our political process. Not necessarily to favor one candidate over another, but to undermine our process by further polarizing our system by overloading it with content and messaging that is factually not true. Democracy at odds with itself is the goal of many of these entities, and the spreading of fake news to promote those means has led to an unprecedented increase in the number of online outlets that peddle this news and use social networks to put that content distribution on steroids, spreading it far and wide. Even closer to home, I worry daily about local journalism. Where is it going? I worry about how readers are informing themselves, how we've let social media hijack both our profits and in some cases our integrity. We in the news industry, both locally and nationally, get swept up and caught in the middle of an increasingly polarized and distrusting public that has been fed truly fake news on platforms that are not in the hands of stewards focused on truth in the same way most journalistic entities are on any given day. And on top of it, thanks in no small part to what's happening in the political world, we aren't beloved in many places right now. And our job, especially overseas, has gotten far more dangerous these past few years. The number of journalists who have been killed worldwide keeps climbing, more than 78 in the last 2 years. During the protests over George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, journalists across the country were confronted, attacked, and in some cases injured by both police and protesters. One of my former colleagues, and an unbelievably courageous national reporter for the Los Angeles Times, was both pepper sprayed and hit with rubber bullets in Minneapolis. Her live Twitter feed was terrifying for journalists. I would argue that it's just not a coincidence that when you have world leaders attacking independent journalism at unprecedented levels, the spillover effect is leading down bad paths. As we consider the breadth and depth of the fake news problem, let's think about this for a minute. Would any credible news outlet in the country allowing patently false statements under the guise of editorial be able to keep their audience? I would argue most newspapers would have folded up a long time ago. Today, legitimate news organizations are thrown in the middle of a sea of content from who knows where, and we sit and hope that millions of readers can discern what's accurate and what's not. Many days, my worry about the loss of faith in journalism is far deeper than that of a business model being disrupted. Smart work is being done on that model, but it is much harder to win back hearts and minds of readers who aren't carefully separating fact from fiction. And even as we work hard to figure out a new business model that will keep our journalism strong, we must come together as an industry to reestablish trust and inform readers on the difference between credible information and disinformation. I've said this before, we should not be shy about using our platforms to make sure our readers know the difference and stand up and call it out when necessary. More work has to be done to put pressure on social media networks to take more responsibility in making sure that distribution platforms are not misused. There's been halting progress in this area, and platforms like Twitter and Facebook have not gone far enough in policing the content that users see on their sites. A lot of eyes were on the recent Taiwan national election as Facebook took unprecedented steps to try to stem the flow of disinformation in the days leading up to the election. The results were mixed. Despite Facebook setting up a well-staffed war room to identify and counteract false information being spread by Chinese content farms, disinformation was still a problem. And even as it experimented in Taiwan, Facebook does not intend to fix those issues at home that led to the massive disinformation problem in 2016. It has said in the past that it will not police the truthfulness of political messages, much to the dismay of Congress and other critics. It is not all gloom and doom, however. There has been a lot of research going on into the fake news phenomena, with some promising signs and possible solutions. Just recently, the Journalists' Resource, a project of the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, wrote about some of the compelling research being done on experiments in combating fake news. Some of the findings, including more direct tagging on false news stories or headlines like "rated false," show some signs of being effective in informing readers of fake news. Also, crowdsourcing of news also shows signs of being effective in countering the problems, where people come together and actually point out in kind of a crowdsourcing way, to point at what content is fake versus what's real. And just recently, Twitter has even started taking some action against some of the president's misleading tweets. In May, it began putting fact-checking verification notices on some of the president's tweets for the first time. And last week, it labeled a video tweeted by the president as manipulated media for the first time. That video showed a black child running away from a white child while playing, with a fake CNN caption before the video accuses CNN of fake news. It was all false. So where does this leave traditional journalism in the future, in a world where fake news forces will most likely continue to play havoc? For decades, newsrooms were guided by fairly stringent but simple standards. Reporters reported the news. They quoted sources as accurately as possible and wrote what they witnessed. The trust with the reader was a bond forged by the words on a page of newsprint. Reporters would quote from public documents, court records, and take notes on what politicians, judges, and other officials said, and it was on to the next story. In the future, transparency will be key. Technology is already making that easier, but reporters and editors will be expected to show more of their reporting than ever before. In some places, it's already happening. Most news organizations now post documents to their stories to supplement their reporting. They need to do more of this. I would also argue that it would be more commonplace for news organizations to add background boxes to their stories, kind of a sort of how did we report this tutorial, explaining in great detail how they reported this. They're adding actual tweets and more aggressively suing public entities under the Freedom of Information Act laws for documentation, video, audio, and other publicly held information, and posting that information much more often. In many cases, you already see news organizations letting readers know exactly how many sources they talk to in reporting their stories. That's a key point in demonstrating to readers how thorough their reporting has been in collecting information. Publications like the Washington Post are adding fact-checking posts on their sites, letting readers see in real time whether political leaders and others are telling the truth. All of this means more work for already stretched newsrooms, but I argue that it's crucial, and it is making newsrooms and reporters better. Behind the scenes, news organizations have to get better in building deeper engagements with their audience, and they have to be willing to be transparent when they get the story wrong. The New York Times and the work they've done to understand their audience is paying incredible dividends at this moment, even as the advertising picture looks grim. The New York Times added 273,000 new online readers in the third quarter of 2019 alone. It's 273,000 paying readers. The Times audience is now its biggest in history, with a total number of print and digital subscribers at close to 5 million. The New York Times is not alone. Big national players like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Financial Times are spending a lot of money to develop deeper engagements with their audiences. And they are spending money to counter the fake news narrative by adding money on advertising. 3 years ago, the New York Times took an unusual step to spend lavishly on a stark advertising commercial that aired on the Oscars, centered around the message of the pursuit of truth. The Washington Post added a message on its website around its journalism that reads, "Democracy dies in darkness." News organizations will continue to have to counter the negative narrative surrounding the industry, aggressively using their platforms to celebrate their journalism and the fact-gathering process. Readers, too, have to be part of the process, and they need to be vigilant. Until social media outlets police their platforms, I would urge readers to take a minute to figure out where the content they are reading is coming from. For the most part, it is a simple search at sources if that source is unfamiliar, but it is a crucial step before sharing that content. I also urge readers to continue to read and watch opinions they deem to be outside their own leanings. The more informed one is on a topic and hearing from all sides, the easier it is to separate fact from fiction. If you lean left, read the Wall Street Journal editorial page once in a while. Likewise, if you lean right, take a spin through the New York Times editorial pages now and then. You may not agree, but that's okay. You will have better discussions with your friends, I guarantee it. Finally, we need to let readers behind the scenes of our deepest reporting. One of the more difficult things for news organizations to do is to show the thorough, dogged reporting that goes on in newsrooms around the country on a daily basis. Stories like the one I referenced earlier when I was at the Los Angeles Times are the epitome of fact-based reporting that is important in exposing truths that in some cases help save people from harm going forward. A story about the USC gynecologist who preyed on college students for decades took months of reporting by 3 dedicated journalists. Getting dozens of victims to trust and talk, finding and getting those who witnessed the doctor to come forward and tell their story, risking retribution from one of the most powerful private institutions in Southern California. There were many people who didn't want that story to be told. The story had to be right. I am convinced that if more readers could see the passion and dedication of reporters wanting to tell the truth on a daily basis, that would go a long way in separating real news and the influx of fake players out there. There is no other alternative. At the end of the day, no one wants to be lied to. No one wants to feel as that they've shared something that is inherently false. But as an industry, we need to come together and make it easy for our readers to see the difference. I'm bullish that this will happen. Thank you for your time. And again, I wish we could all be here together. And hopefully we will have that chance in the future. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Do you have any questions, Karen? Oh, I think you still have her muted.
Okay. You hear me fine?
I can hear you.
Okay. I was going to ask about the media bias chart that is put out. It's on the ad font. I'm saying it wrong. It is on the adfontsmedia.com page,
Mhm.
and I've had people tell me it's done wrong. It's not real. It's biased in itself. But I was wondering what you thought about it.
I haven't spent a lot of time looking at that. You know, I, I, I do think sites like that that are trying to, or that may be touting themselves um, as separating fact from fiction, or separating bias from just straight news. I think part of the issue is that those sites haven't done a great job in sort of being transparent um, uh, in their own ability to show how they aren't being, how they're not biased.
Right.
So it is, I think, one of the biggest challenges um, of trying to show transparency is really doing it in a way that you're going to gain the trust of those readers who are going to come to look at that as a place where they can make solid decisions about content. That's going to be tricky for sure for anyone. There's a couple of other firms. NewsGuard is one of them that started out of New York and started by Stephen Brill, who's a longtime journalist. That is painfully going to news sites and doing some very thorough um, uh, kind of reporting on the actual news sites. You know, there's a number of news sites who actually that do a kind of a terrible job actually telling people who's part of their organization and how their organization works. And so they've done a nice job kind of grading news sites and grading their content. And they go through a very exhaustive kind of play by play on how they do it. So the more that those sites can show how they're testing and news sites, I think the better off they're going to be.
Another question I had is, do you have a preferred fact-checking site? I know Snopes gets a lot of trashing because of their alleged con- um, connection to George Soros, and I know that there's a number of other ones. Do you have one that you prefer?
NewsGuard is one of them. I think Snopes, if something comes up and we're not sure, we will, look at Snopes and make sure that that's not the only source that we're going to. We also, as a rule, we do not pick up on any content from a source that we are unsure of or that we know already has an inherent bias. So it's kind of a standard rule, and I would say that was also the case when I was at the Sun Times and the Tribune. You don't take content even from a legitimate news site, just post it without really trying to fact check it yourself first. And if you can't, then you attribute it to a traditional news site. You really do that only with the ones that you know have a solid track record for reporting the truth, or at least attempting to.
I think I have one.
Yeah.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you think of the last time that you might have fallen for fake news or misinformation, or even if it was like in your personal life, if you came across something, read it, and you were like, okay, that sounds kind of believable, and then later on you checked it and it was just totally fabricated.
Yeah, I think I'm probably in a different boat than most readers. I'm so fearful of spreading
Right.
anything that would be false.
Yeah.
I tend to check constantly if something comes into my news feed, or whether or not, if I'm unfamiliar with it, or so if somebody shares something. I tend to look first to see where that content is coming from. Sometimes it's hard because it'll be, someone may share something from a site that aggregates content, and finding the original source of that it takes a little bit of sleuthing to do that. But I'm so nervous. I just I'm very careful about what I share that's not our own content, and
Right.
make sure it's from a legitimate news source.
Right. Cool. All right.
Sorry, I was thinking, um, how, one of the things that I noticed that some of my friends will, they'll share something that um, they think is credible, um, and then when I go hunting it down, I'm finding that it's either one side or the other spectrum, um, of political thought, but that it's not being carried by the mainstream media. And as soon as I say to them, you know, I don't see this in the mainstream media, the first thing they say is, and I know you know what I'm going to come up with this. They go, "Oh, you mean the lamestream media?" And
Yeah.
I'm like, "Oh, please." But how, when I when people are looking at some of these articles thinking, oh, my friend really seems on it, and then they click on it, what should they be looking for, um, specifically that says whether or not this is credible?
I think it goes back to tracing back where that source of information is coming from. That story about the police officer scribbling on getting that coffee cup from McDonald's with the alleged expletive. The worrisome part of that was that a legitimate news source in the New York Post ended up picking that up. And I don't know, I haven't gone back and checked, but it was, been weeks after they had not run a retraction or anything to. They may have done so since, but I haven't seen. I just haven't gone back to look. So the problem, the worrisome part is when a news source that is as popular and as well known as something like the New York Post, or picks something up that is patently false and doesn't correct it. That's where things get really tricky, because then even tracing it back, and you could do a cursory look at it, and it pops up as a legitimate news story, and then there's nothing really in that in your search feed that points to it as being false. And so then it gets easier for people to spread that, right? I think people really have to take a step back and kind of do two or three or four steps of tracing, if they're not familiar with that source, and really carefully understand where that's coming from. In other cases, to your point, Karen, I've seen that happen, and then people, which this is what gives me hope. People from one side or the other will jump in very quickly and kind of try to point people. I think people have a natural inclination to try to help people, not be wrong. And so I do see both in my feed and just generally as I scroll through Twitter that people will try to crowdsource accuracy. It doesn't happen all the time, of course, uh, but I do think for the most part, as I said in my talk, that people don't really want to spread inherently want to spread false information, and they will listen to trusted friends and family um, if they're able to point that out successfully. There's just until we have some kind of self-policing on platforms by those companies, readers are really going to have to be vigilant. It's really that's a big part.
Yeah. One of my favorite things that you said during the talk, just because I rarely get like a journalist point of view, was how you mentioned how journalists, they used to report the news, they report what they saw, etc. So you'd get that bond with the journalist. Um, do you think that that's one of the primary factors behind a lot of people just eating up this fake news, is they have they were used to having that bond. That's how it it used to be the case that journalists, they always report what they saw, etc. So they still have that bond with that journalist, but misinformation is so rampant. Is it would you be able to speak on that?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. That's a great observation, Austin. I think you know I think there still is, if you we notice, like on our Twitter feed, for example, and I noticed this at the Sun Times as well and Tribune. Um, the bond, if a reporter tweets his or her own story, or tweets a story of a colleague, or tweets something else, there is, in some ways, social media has made the connection to the reporter even closer. There's a real person there, as opposed to somebody who in newsprint, where it's he or she's either faceless, and you just see a byline.
Yeah.
You recognize the byline maybe. Uh, but Twitter has allowed a different kind of conversation to happen between a reporter and a reader, um, and, and, um, and some of that's good. But the issue, the, the the main issue that from a technology standpoint, is that the access to all sorts of content has become so much easier for people. Before it was either you get your newspaper, or there were three television stations that had daily news, and you pick from that. There were three networks, and you pick one from that, and all sort of, you based it on more of the style rather than the kind of news they were putting out, because you like that anchor, or you like the way somebody wrote, you like Mike Royko, you liked another columnist at a newspaper. But the way that people can access information so quickly and easily now is absolutely part of the issue, in that those with ill intent have been able to seize on that, and could um, you know uh, distribute false information much more quickly and easily than ever in the past.
Cool. Thank you.
I wanted to ask a question in regards to something you said in your talk. You said that more newspapers are giving follow up information or historic information that might have led up to the story, and I see that a lot in my when I'm looking at a story online, and I'm curious to know if you guys are able to track if people are reading those additional informations pieces that are put in with the story.
Yeah, that's a good point. We can, if we're able to set, let's just say we add a document um, to a story, we are able to track whether how many people have clicked onto that document. In some cases, not all the time. It is hard to know how many people are really taking the time to, really study if you do post a court document or some other official piece of information, how much time they're spending with it. I do think readers appreciate knowing that they have access to that, and that if we are taking the time to post it along with the reporting, that it makes them feel better about the accuracy of the story, and that they can, even if they didn't in that first go around with the story, but they know they can come back to it, and that piece of information is going to be there. So it's more of having the reader having a better comfort level with the reporting of that story, than if the information wasn't there.
I know I have friends who will quote the court documents, and I can only think they're looking at their desktop or their laptop, because when I try to look at it on my phone, the print is even tinier than the original story, and I can't read it at all.
Yeah, it's tough.
But when I do get to, my real computer, as I like to call it, it is kind of fascinating to read that stuff. Or when you hear, I listen to Nina Totenberg on
Hmm.
NPR when she's going through the transcript of the Supreme Court justices' rulings, or just their discussion,
Yeah,
and that's quite fascinating. And I think it's important for us to hear or know those things so we can know how things are decided at those levels.
you're exactly right, Karen. Providing that transcript gives much more context to a story than you could probably write as a reporter. Um, if you can, those Supreme Court deliberations really shed light. We had a couple this past week, and they really shed much more light on than you probably really do in just a 600 to 800 word story.
Right.
All right. Well, that's all from me, I think. I don't think I have anything else, Karen.
I no.
All right.
Normally, I would be asking you, other questions, but on this topic, yeah, it's very it's frustrating, because you want, as librarians, we want to be able to point people to
Yeah.
good sources. Um, and I know one of the most frustrating things for me is having friends who post something up, and they want to do it as a thought piece, but they don't say anything, and so it sounds like this is their opinion, and it can be
Yeah,
very frustrating. But we're always looking for, well, how do you know this is a good source? When we want to teach, whether we're in a public library or in a school setting, finding if that is a good resource. And I've actually had um, people say, "Oh, Wikipedia is not worth it," and then there was that study from a few years ago showing that they have only a 4% error rate, which is pretty amazing.
it is pretty amazing. Yeah.
So, and I know when I'm telling people, you know, don't go to Wikipedia for the information. Look at their articles, that they've listed as their bibliography,
Hmm.
to dig deeper into the subject. That it's a good starting point. And I didn't know if where I was curious, maybe where does the newspaper go when you're trying to get at a starting point?
Yeah, I don't. Most news organizations I've been with, we don't use Wikipedia, just because it's easy for false information to be mixed in with real information. Though I do think there's good crowdsourcing in a lot of Wikipedia posts. But I do think, to your point, that getting any time you're using even just as a starting point, a source that's going to point you to somewhere else, you gotta just keep digging to get to the absolute original, as close as you can to the original piece of information, the original sourcing of that information, and then and be sure that it's accurate. That's Accuracy is king, for sure.
Yes, it is.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed it. Um,
Great.
And we hope to have you back soon when we
When we can gather, that'd be great.
yeah, when we can gather, and then then we'll really have a talk. That'll be exciting. All right.
Anytime.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, yeah. Well, I don't know what it looks like in the future, but we'll definitely keep you posted. So, yeah, thank you again.
You bet. Thanks, guys.